It is a great day for us as a church. It is, in a sense, an end. It is the end of our 150th anniversary celebration. It is, in another sense, a great beginning. And as we do this, as we seal this cornerstone with the time capsule in it, I'm reminded that we make some assumptions. Now, sometimes people are down on assumptions. One of the things I love about assumptions is that whether we recognize it or not, every time you make an assumption, it's an act of faith. You assume your car will start in the morning. You assume when you sit down the pew will hold you. You assume that there'll be breath in your lungs in the morning. You assume things that I'm struck as we think about the gospel and the future of our church, that we assume something as we seal the cornerstone and this time capsule. We assume that there will be a building here when it's open here. We assume there will be a vibrant, healthy congregation like we are. And so as we do this, it's an act of faith. And I am very aware that in our legacy here, previous generations did this. 1865, it's the end of the Civil War. Can you think of a more turbulent time? Lincoln has been assassinated. It's a rough time. And 9 people by faith began this church. They weren't looking at the world, they weren't looking at the circumstances, they weren't worried. By act of faith, they began this church, and then our church, through several buildings, 1959, it's almost the height of the Cold War. A young man, Fidel Castro, is now ruling Cuba. And just 70 miles off the coast of Florida, we have a communist country. We're 3 years from the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's bad. In response to the Soviet aggression, the U.S. will that year fire the Titan intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time to fuel both our space program and to allow us to strike targets. It's a difficult, dark time. And yet, by faith, they laid the cornerstone for us. And so you and I, as we do this morning, and we look at the gospel that has kept this church for 150 years and will keep this church, I think about the gospel message and the faith. We stand in the legacy of their faith as we do this. I'm very aware that we are part of that history. And so this morning, let us look and admire their faith, and then let us emulate it. Again, as I said, it's both the end of our anniversary celebration and a new beginning. You'll see the time capsule that's been welded for us, and we'll have that street side. But as we do that, I want us to stand and read Romans 1, 6 through 17, because I see in this passage the reason why this church is still here. There are many churches that did not make it to their 150th anniversary. What is it that grounds a church? It can't be the people. We make mistakes. What is it? And Paul says this in verses 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. Please be seated. I see in this passage 4 truths that are as old as Adam in God's redemptive plan and as new as the future. The last day on earth, the last day before Jesus returns and the sky lightens and he descends from the east, the great trumpet and shout, these gospel truths will hold. And so as I look back at 150 years and look at our future, I just see these. I see 4 encouraging past and future gospel truths. You may be thinking pop culture has been very interesting the last couple months. We've just rolled past the date in Back to the Future. People have been talking online newspapers about when they tried to predict the future, things that they got right and things they got wrong. There's a very real sense in which these path truths of the gospel are our future. They never grow old. I see 4 of them. I see first the reason why we have confidence, the power of the God in it. I see our gospel mission to everyone who believes. I see the content of the gospel, the righteousness of God. And I see the way we respond to it by faith. 4 truths that have propelled this church for 150 years, and 4 gospel truths that as you and I dig in, and we rejoice in what God has done here, and we look to the future, these are the foundation of our church. Notice that all 4 have to do with Jesus. Indeed, when Peter confesses, he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says to him, I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock, this confession of me, I will build my church. Let us rebuild and grow our church that way. I see first that the gospel power is alive and well in this. It's our confidence. Think for a minute of what the opposite of confidence is. And this may be painful for some of you, but I need to go back to your teenage years. You may have confidence now, but you once didn't. Opposite of confidence is fear and shame. What was it when you were in school that you wanted no one to know? It might have been something about your appearance that you covered up. Looked in the mirror in the morning and you did a major work to cover something up, so no one would see what you actually looked like. Or maybe it was something more serious. Maybe it was your family. Maybe you lived in fear that someone would discover something about your family. Your parents' divorce, or the alcoholic in your family, or mental illness in the days when that would have been scandalous. I've been praying this week that if you have something in your life this week, this month, that causes you that kind of shame, that you would not open up about it, that God will heal that this morning. Because Paul says, I am not ashamed. We either have confidence in the power of the gospel and the lives we can build on, or we have shame. Paul says, I'm not afraid of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of it. That we live in a day and age that shames the gospel. Turn on television, watch movies, read books. People are saying things about our gospel. It doesn't work. Some sort of bloody religion. It has to do with the cross. People have always attacked Christianity. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed because it's power. And he uses the Greek word here from which we get a small word, dynamite. Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation. Paul has traveled, he's been beaten, he's been stoned, he's been shipwrecked, and Paul says, I'm not worried, because wherever I go, I find people who need power. And my gospel, the gospel our church has been built upon, is power. There are a few things you can say about the past, the present, and the future that are inevitably true. I know some people may quip that death and taxes, but I want to suggest to you that power is needed to fix problems. Different sets, I know that. And if you're in 1865, it's a different set of problems than 1959. Who knows what problems await us in 5 years? But Paul understood something that you and I need to just refocus on as a church this morning, which is the greatest need that human beings have is for salvation. That's why when Jesus encountered the paralytic man, he forgives his sin before he gives him the ability to walk. Jesus always looked right past the immediate need, the felt needs people had, and he always went after the heart. The greatest need is salvation. And Paul says, I am confident that wherever I go, the power of God is unleashed. You could just turn this around and you could say, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the explosive force of God for change. Because salvation, we're going to see, is not just deliverance from sin, but salvation is rescue. The gospel heals families. The gospel heals cultures. The gospel rescues parents and children that are estranged. The gospel is the power of God. It is the way He works. Remember Genesis? God speaks, and the world comes to existence. And now God speaks in the gospel, and the world is turned upside down. And so you and I, as we look at our celebration outside, we look to our past and we look to our future. We look to that power. And maybe the contrast will help. Sometimes you and I trust in things that don't work out. Humorous example first, maybe painful for some of you. Your sports team. You read the recruiting, you read the stats, the preseason rankings. Everything is perfect for your team. They're going to win. And then the season starts. And you begin to discover that your hope was misplaced. That what you thought would happen doesn't quite measure up. It happens all the time. People come along and they think that something new will save the day. Arthur Summerfield, 1959. Now his name may strike you as a little familiar. He was actually the U.S. postmaster under Dwight Eisenhower. He actually has his name in our post office. When I finish this illustration, you go to the post office this week and you snicker at his name, don't tell them why you're snickering. I don't want them to misdirect the church's mail. Arthur Summerfield was an ambitious political man. He craved power. He had run unsuccessfully as governor of Michigan. But throwing his stakes in with Eisenhower, when Eisenhower came into the presidency, he became postmaster. And he was an ambitious man, and he thought of his legacy. Most people don't make a mark as postmaster general. He's going to. So mail has been delivered by foot, and by horse, by train, and by car, and by plane. Let's try missile mail. So June 8th, 1959. He's in the back, in the center. Again, it's hard to see. He is on the USS Barbaro. It is a missile carrier, and what they're doing is they're loading 3,000 commemorative letters that he had designed. And the crew takes the nuclear device out of the tip of the guided missile. They put the 3,000 letters in it, and they fire it in Florida. Caused some alarm in Florida, can you imagine? And it worked. It successfully landed 100 miles away. It landed, and it gave rise to artist renditions of what the post office would look like today. Seemed promising, didn't it? The power for the future. He's quoted as saying, before man reaches the moon, your mail will be delivered within hours from New York to California, to England, to India, or to Australia by guided missiles. We stand on the threshold of rocket mail. You see, some people are trusting in things that will never materialize. Social programs or different things or government. But Paul says, my gospel will not fail. Has never, will never. After all, isn't Paul Exhibit A? An angry, chauvinistic, religious hater, killing men and women for the gospel. When they would confess Jesus as Lord, he would cast his stone against them. A religious murderer, a zealot, an extremist. And on his way to Damascus to kill more Christians, he encounters Jesus, the gospel. And the hater of Christianity becomes the greatest preacher of Christianity we've ever known. Paul says, when I get to Rome and I preach the gospel, things are going to change. And you and I look out on Pinkneyville, we look out on our families today, and we say, Lord, unleash that gospel power. We believe that. The old gospel we've sung of is true. There's more, though. If you have power, you need direction. Think about this. You've never heard anybody say, well, when I had the accident, I didn't have my foot on the accelerator, but I had a tight grip on the steering wheel. The accelerator or the steering wheel, which one's more important? Teenagers, if you've just taken driver's ed, I hope you know. Parents, check with you. The steering wheel is a whole lot more than an accelerator. So you have to have direction. And what we have here is that the gospel is God's power, but the gospel invitation is also our mission. Paul says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. If the gospel is the power to save, the gospel is the power to change people, our mission is to proclaim it. And you would think that this would be easy for individuals and churches to remember, but so often they get off. The church that started 50 years ago, preaching the gospel and inviting people, no longer invites people. They're just content on a Sunday morning to be there. Or churches get off and they pursue liberal agendas and social change or the latest political controversy, whether it's conservative or liberal. You see, Paul says, my heartbeat is to unleash the power of the gospel on all. And that's why he says, Jews and Greeks, that would be two extremes. You could say today male and female, American, non-American. You could not be more radically different than Jews and Greeks. Paul says, my message doesn't change. The power of the gospel holds. It changes eternity. And my mission, and your mission, because remember he's writing to Christians, is to share the gospel. And so we do. We exhort, we implore, we beg, we warn, we caution. Everything we do as a church that honors God is to invite people. Come to my God. Come to his gospel and let him change you. You see, we've got the power and we've got the mission. And it's interesting because the way Paul writes this, I want you to understand, he thinks he's going to go preach to unbelievers, but there's a mistake that people make. Florida Orange Growers Association made famous the slogan, "Orange juice is not just for breakfast anymore." The gospel is not just for unbelievers. Paul is coming to Rome to preach the gospel to save believers. See, we do something wrong sometimes, pastors. We think that the gospel, you just preach it when you're trying to get people saved. And then once people get saved, we just stop talking about the gospel. We talk about marriage and parenting and children and all these things. And we leave the gospel at the beginning of the Christian life. That's not what Paul says. Because in verse 16 that I gave you up there at the top, notice Paul says, "For, because I'm not ashamed." He's giving a reason. And this is what Paul's going to do. "Thus, for my part, I'm eager to preach the gospel to you, also in Rome." Paul says, I'm coming to Rome, to you believers, to preach the gospel at you. Day after day after day, song after song after song, the gospel. You and I never wrote past it. That's why you hear the gospel in this church and are singing and are preaching every Sunday. Because the gospel is the power of God. And when we preach the gospel, we say it to ourselves and we say, Jesus died for you. God offers you forgiveness. There's grace. Mature believer, there's grace. You fell on your face this week. There's grace in the gospel for you. There's grace for your families. You see, Paul is coming to Rome. He's so excited about preaching the gospel that he writes them this little 16-chapter letter. The letter is sent on ahead, not by missile mail, but by ship. He sends this letter ahead and he says, I'm going to give you the gospel in advance. And when I come there, this is what I'm going to preach. The gospel is always appropriate for us. You unleash God's power when you say the gospel. When you explain, when you focus on God and not human beings. Again, churches get off. I just put up here mission drift. That happens in organizations. Happens a lot. They talk about it, whether it's a charity or sometimes a church. It just simply means the way you began, you're doing something different. And the classic example is Harvard. Remember why Harvard was founded? You may not know. It's so far from its roots. 18 years after the Pilgrims landed in New England, they established Harvard. And this is a quote from their founding. It can still be found at Harvard on a plaque. After God had carried us safely to New England, and we built our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, raised convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for, looked after, was to advance learning and to perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present minister should lie in the dust. Now, I know people pick on the Puritans and the Pilgrims that came from them. But I want to say this, they were a lot wiser than our contemporary culture. They wanted educated pastors. They knew that the proclamation of the gospel would take everything in the Bible. And they founded Harvard as a divinity school. Our first Ivy League school, your other Ivy League schools were also founded as divinity schools. Early rules and precepts, this is early years. This is principle number 2. If you are admitted to Harvard, this is your student manual. Number 2, let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, John 17:3. Has Harvard drifted from its roots? Quite a bit. Can churches do it? All the time. Churches become a social gathering, or a civic organization that does good, or a political activist place whether liberal or conservative, that's what you do, that's what you hear preached. And they drift from their roots. But you and I this morning look back at 150 years and say, thank you, God, that this church has always been about the gospel. We would not be here if that was not true. And we look forward and say, Lord, we're recommitting this morning. This is a consecration to you. We want your gospel power. And we want to be on mission for you. And we do not want to drift from that. There are a lot of good things you can do and you can miss the best. May we not drift from gospel proclamation. That's very healthy in our church today. It's what we pray for as we go on. What is this gospel? Paul tells us because you may have power and direction but not have content. Again, I'm not trying to be political this morning, but I just think of some of the political debates you see, and you see very powerful men and women who are very much on mission, and then you kind of listen and you're like, well, what's the plan? And it comes down to elect me. Well, what's your idea? What's the content? You see, gospel power and our gospel mission mean nothing if we don't have the gospel content, and that's hope. And so whether this is the first time this morning you've ever heard this clearly, or whether this is something you'd say, Pastor, I just know this with all my heart. Here's the gospel content. Here's what the gospel is. For it is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. The righteousness of God revealed. I pondered this week an interesting thing we have in English. We have the word awe. And depending on what you do with the word awe, it's good or bad. And the gospel is awful and awesome. Thought about the bad news of the gospel? What holds us back? We've got a neighbor or a friend, and God's convicting us to share the gospel with them, and we think, Lord, I can't, because the first thing I have to do is tell them they're lost. That the gospel says, you owe God your soul, and you are in debt to Him. The gospel first says you are in so much trouble, and then the glory of the gospel is God is taking care of it. The righteousness that God requires of humans, He also gives them as a gift. That's what this says. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. I can't be good enough to go to heaven on my own merit. No one can. You can't. But the reason why the gospel's power is because you say to somebody who's down their luck, who's kind of beaten down by life, or the most successful person you know, you say, whether you realize it or not, you're a failure. And my God killed His Son for failures like you and me. And the good news of the gospel is that what God requires of us, He gives. That is so incredibly important. That's what fires our hope. A little bit later, Paul's going to say there's two ways to try to reach heaven. I'm only giving you verse 5. One way is to work. It's the can-do American spirit. And again, it infects our churches. People will say, now come to my church, we'll give you a bunch of rules, a bunch of regulations, and we'll help you along the way. Come to church on Sunday, we'll give you a pep rally. We'll get you all fired up about working for God. And if you climb this ladder, you can go to heaven. Paul says no. But to the one who does not work, but believes on Him who declares the ungodly to be righteous, his faith is credited as righteousness. Pretty shocking, isn't it? To declare the ungodly to be righteous. If you heard of a judge who every time somebody guilty but comes before him, he says, I know you're guilty, but you're free of the charges, you're declared innocent, you and I be up in arms. We'd be so angry with that unrighteous judge. To say that the guilty or innocent is shocking. God does it all the time. When you were saved by the grace of the gospel, that's what God said. He said, I should hold everything against you, but I pour it all on my Son. That is the power of the gospel. No matter how low, no matter how broken, no matter how sinful the people are, our families, our friends, our community, we send our missionaries, no matter where you go, you can never find somebody so low, so broken, or so evil, they can't be saved. And so for 150 years, our church has said that to this community. In love, we love our town, but for 150 years, the generations before us have said to people, I love you enough to tell you the awful news that you are condemned. And I love you enough to tell you the awesome news that you can be forgiven. And the degree to which you and I are faithful to do that and be loyal to the gospel is our future. It is our legacy. We would not be here. Think about it. The gospel could have perished in this church in one generation. They start with 9, they raise their kids in the Lord, the kids walk away from the Lord, they don't tell anybody about the great gospel, it's gone. We wouldn't even know the church was here. Might not have ever left the temperance hall. But generation after generation after generation spoke the gospel, and obviously it worked. They built an enormous church. Person after person after person bowed the knee to Jesus and said, I want that. That's power. That's who we are. That's our future. There's a danger in every generation for churches. Again, if there's a danger of not believing that the gospel is power, and there's a danger of mission drift. There's also danger. Now some of you like these kind of shows. I'm not picking on these shows. DIY. I can't think of a better summary of American Christianity. Do it yourself. Every generation of sinful human beings want to add. You come to them and say, your house is condemned. And they say, no, I just need to polish it up a little bit. God wants to save you from your sin. Can you just give me some pointers? You see what God offers: a new life, a new heart. If anyone's in Christ, he's a new creature. God does not offer to clean you up. He does not offer to renovate you. And he does not offer to let you help. But there are churches that compromise on this, and they become a culture of do-gooders and religious people who, you come into church and they say every Sunday, you're such a great person. I'm such a great person. We're all fine. I'm okay, you're okay. And you and I laugh because that's the culture around us, but it affects churches. You and I don't do that. We instead resist that. We come together and we say, bless God. Bless God. The gospel says that in my imperfections I'm saved. Gospel power for our future from our past. Gospel mission from our past to our future. Gospel hope. And then all you and I need is response. Gospel faith is our response. What do you do with the power of God? The mission. What do you do with this hope? Paul says, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As is written, the righteous man shall live by faith. Quote from Habakkuk 2:4. So this is a very old principle from the Old Testament. Sometimes people pick up their Old Testaments. They say, Pastor, all these rules. Wow. If I'd been alive back then, I don't think all those rules could have saved me. You're right. Nobody in the Old Testament was saved by following rules. Everybody has always been saved by faith. If Adam and Eve are in heaven, it's by faith in the Messiah that's coming. Noah, faith in the Messiah that's coming. The God of the Old Testament said, don't worry, my power is coming. My power is coming to save you. Believe it. Abraham believes against belief that he can have children and God saves him. Noah believes that God will bring a flood. Faith has always been, God said it, I'll respond to that. It has always been, and so you and I hold that up this morning. We say, the power of God, the mission of God, the hope, you and I respond by faith. This is going to mean if you've never received the gospel, you need to this morning, but it may mean that you need to recommit to this. To live by faith. There's a couple of things. There's definitely mental assent to gospel truths. Then when we talk about faith, God always honors us. He made us in His image. He always works through our head. You cannot love what you don't know. Unless you've been in chemistry recently, I can say, I want you this morning to love Avogadro's number. And you forgot it from chemistry. You can't love what you don't remember. Number of atoms in the mole, in case it bothers some of you. You can't love what you don't know, and so you and I say, Lord, I want to learn about you. I want to know about you. I want to listen. I want to study. I want to know what you say about your faith. It is doctrine. That's why we have Sunday school. That's why we have disciple training. That's why we listen to sermons instead of just worship. We can sing a lot of worship songs. That's why we study. Because God always moves from the head to the heart. But faith is more than mental assent. It's also whole life. It's a whole life response. People who just say, I'm a Christian, I got it in my head. I know, Pastor, I know that Jesus died for me. Not really caring. That's not saving faith. The demons know Jesus died. That's what James says. It doesn't profit them. Faith is a whole response, and this is where it really gets deep for you and I to say, Lord, I believe the gospel. I've been reminded of it this morning, and I will respond. And my life will bear evidence